Hello everyone, and thank you for joining this talk on neural rendering fields and their applications. In this talk, I'll be talking about some publications from other authors and some publications from our team at Microsoft, but it will all be about neural radiance fields. So, neural radiance fields, or NeRFs for short, are methods in the field of novel view synthesis. This means the method takes as input a number of images of a scene and learns to generate new views from any desired pose or any pose close to the training data. And that's what you can see here. You can see two NeRF models, one trained on this digger, another trained on this plate. And the views you're seeing are not training views, they were not seen during training of the method. They're just novel views generated using NeRF. Here are some more views you can see on real scenes. As you can see, they look very, very realistic. And as an example, you can see reflections of the faucet here on the right, which look very, very realistic, at least in my eyes. And perhaps this explains the incredible success and popularity of this method, with over 800 citations in 2 years. And lots of new works appearing all the time. I was reading papers for CVPR a couple of weeks ago, and one of the other reviewers was actually complaining that he's reviewing another NeRF paper, and that it's all NeRF papers. It's been a huge popular success in novel view synthesis. So let's see how. Well, maybe it's for the start with what are NeRFs trained on. So first of all, you need a set of training images for your scene. This is from maybe 20 to a few hundred images of a single scene. But importantly, for vanilla, for traditional NeRF, and there are extensions that are needed, but for traditional normal NeRF, it has to be just one scene. You train one model for one static scene. And the static, that there are also upgrades that don't require to be static, but for normal NeRF, it's static. Another thing you need is the projection matrix for each image. This projection matrix is a composition of the camera pose, so rotation and position of the camera, as well as the camera parameters, such as the focal length or the principal point. And lastly, you need a rough estimate of the scene size. Images can be obtained with the camera, and then the projection matrices and the estimate of the scene size can be obtained using off-the-shelf tools such as Metashape, Colmap, and others, some of them being free. So you can just take a few photos of a scene, get this data, and train your own NeRF for it if you want to. Now, how does NeRF work? So importantly, NeRF, the neural network part in it is just a MLP, a multi-layer perceptron, and it actually predicts outputs for points in space, not even for pixels and not for full images. These are then just composed into the full image. So if you want to render a single pixel of an image, what you do is you shoot a ray from the center of projection of the camera into the scene through the pixel that you want to render, and then along this rays, you sample a number of positions along the ray, and then for each of those samples, you want to compute the output of the NeRF network. And so the input consists of the sample position, so x, y, z, and then phi theta, which is the direction of the ray we sampled along. And we'll talk about why the direction matters in a second. And the output is the color RGB and density sigma. So color is self-explanatory, while density, importantly, means the think of it as transparency of the scene at that point. So if at the point of the sample, there's nothing in the scene, it's just air, the density will likely be very low. While if it's an opaque surface, like maybe a part of this Lego bulldozer, then it's going to be very high. It's not going to let light through it, essentially. And then once you have all these outputs for all the samples along the ray, which you can see visualized here, some of them having lower density, some of them having higher density, then you use what's called volume rendering to combine these into a single pixel. And this is a standard approach known for decades, used commonly in rendering of medical images, for example. And then finally, when you're training your NeRF, you have a loss, and this loss is simply the mean squared error, the L2, known as the L2 loss, between the predicted color and the ground truth color of the pixel. So it's all really quite simple. Then if you look at the network itself, it consists of one part that is conditioned on sample position, this one, and it outputs the sigma. And so important, as you can see, that the sigma, the density, does not depend on the view direction. It only depends on the position in the scene. And then it also outputs a feature vector, which goes in the second part of the MLP, which depends on the sample or the view direction, and that outputs the color. So importantly, as you can see, this is based, this is physically inspired, physically based, where the density of an object does not depend on the view direction. However, the color does, and of course it does, because if you have a shiny surface, the color you see from it will depend on the view direction. For example, a mirror, if you look at it from different sides, a single point on the mirror will reflect different parts of the scene, so it will have a different color. And that's why color depends on the view direction. Now, density can be used to generate geometry. You can essentially think of areas with high density as opaque ones and low density as transparent ones. And this allows us to do interesting things. For example, we can add additional objects into scenes reconstructed using NeRF, like the ball you're seeing here. The ball is correctly occluded by the opaque parts of the scene and not occluded by the transparent parts of the scene. Another cool thing you can do with NeRF is modify the focal length of the camera that you're visualizing this with. Here, for example, we have a dolly effect, where we simulate a situation where the camera goes out of the scene while zooming in at the same time. This is not something you could easily do with a, let's say, GAN-based image generation method. But here, since you control the camera parameters that you're rendering with at test time, regardless of what they were at training time, you can do cool tricks like this one, and you can have truly multi-view consistent rendering, which again is very hard using 2D neural networks. Let's maybe compare this approach. Let's compare NeRF to traditional photogrammetry. By traditional photogrammetry, here I mean methods that reconstruct scenes using meshes. The output of this method, of a traditional method like this one, would be mesh representing this scene. So how does this stack up compared to NeRF? Well, very importantly, NeRF can represent view-dependent effects. And for example, here, you can see this on this piano. As the camera is moving, the reflection of a nearby window changes in the piano, in the score sheet. And I think it makes this scene look incredibly realistic compared to a scene where we just have a 3D construction without the light moving. And achieving something like this using traditional methods would be very, very, very hard. Second of all, NeRF can represent very fine details. For example, here, the leaves of this fern are very, very thin. If this was a mesh, you need to have a separate thin part of the mesh for every single leaf. That would be very hard to generate, yet very possible with NeRF's volumetric rendering approach. Yet another one is that thanks again to volumetric rendering, to volume rendering, NeRF deals naturally with transparency. Here, you can see that the laptop and the apple are clearly visible through the glass. And again, super hard using traditional approaches. Finally, NeRF is differentiable very easily. You can easily propagate gradients through the network, and you can use that to, for example, optimize for the camera position, which we'll talk about in a moment as well. What are some of the downsides? Where first of all, it takes many, many hours to train a single model. In a single GPU, this can mean a day, for example. That's considerably slower than traditional approaches, than reconstructing a mesh of the scene, even if it's not as good. Second of all, NeRF is not compatible with existing 3D tools. You can't put a NeRF into Unity. You can't put the NeRF into Unreal Engine. You can't put the Blender. There are no tools for it. Traditional computer graphics have tools that have been worked on for decades. NeRF doesn't, so obviously it's not as easy to work with yet. And third of all, super importantly, rendering a single frame takes a lot of time. For again, vanilla NeRF, this is something like 20-30 seconds on a high-end GPU, so very slow, not real time at all. And so The first extension to NeRF I'd like to talk about is one that allows for real-time rendering, and this is work published by me and my colleagues at ICCD, International Conference on Computer Vision, last year. So here is a standard NeRF rendering at 0.06 frames per second, incredibly slow. If we wanted to make it real time, what we could do is decrease the resolution, and if we want to run 30 frames per second, we have to decrease it to something like this, which is not acceptable quality for almost any application. What we proposed in FastNeRF, in contrast, is to render NeRF full resolution at hundreds of frames per second with no perceivable or almost no perceivable loss in image quality. So first of all, let's start by looking at why is NeRF slow. If you consider this little square to be a single call to an MLP, then with standard settings, you need 192 of those calls to render a single pixel. And that is quite a lot. Now, if you have an 800 by 800 pixel image, this amounts to about 122 million calls to an MLP to render the whole image. That is a lot of MLP calls, really, and all of them require memory and so on and so forth. So it's a slow process that has to be batched on any GPU. What we propose to do instead is to train a NeRF as normal, however, at test time replaced with a cache, where we essentially trade compute for memory, and we keep the outputs of the NeRF cached in some sort of data structure. So at test time, what we want to do is take our XYZ sample position, theta 5 direction, and look up the NeRF output for those values somewhere in memory, retrieve RGB sigma, and then our only cost is memory lookup, no MLP layers. And then of course, at train time, it's the old normal networks. And then between test and training, we would generate this cache by querying the NeRF network, as you can see here, for those values and storing them in the cache. And this looks fantastic on paper and very easy to do. However, very quickly, you would realize that there is a memory problem here. See, NeRF is a function of 5 variables, XYZ, phi, theta. This means that the size of the cache decreases with the cache resolution, so number of bins per input dimension, to power 5. So we want to have, let's say, 500 bins per input dimension, which is a reasonable number. Then we would need around 30 terabytes of memory, and this is a lot more memory than any modern GPU has, and more than most CPU memory banks would have. So not a very practical method. So what we propose to do to make this tractable is to split the NeRF network into 2 networks. One that is dependent only on sample position, and one that is dependent only on V direction. So now the position dependent network outputs sigma, the density, as previously, as well as a deep radiance map. And this deep radiance map is a set of 3-dimensional vectors that can be combined to create any RGB color for a given position in space. And the direction dependent network outputs weights for the deep radiance map that combine the deep radiance map vectors into RGB. Importantly, this allows us to separately cache sigma in the deep radiance map as a function of 3 input variables, and the weights as a function of 2 input variables. This now means that the larger of the caches scales with number of bins to power 3, and so for a cache of 512 bins per dimension, it's all around 7 gigabytes, easily fitting into memory. Now, if you look at the performance we get with this method, it is around 3 orders of magnitude faster than original NeRF, at least an order of magnitude faster than any approach prior to this one, allowing us to render out hundreds of frames per second. Here are some comparisons of NeRF on the left, taking 17 seconds in this case, and FastNeRF on the right, taking just 5 milliseconds. And here are some more comparisons on real data. Finally, if you want to see some more videos, read our paper, please see this website, where you'll be able to see the videos in their original resolution and also find a link to the paper. Now let's talk about applications of NeRF. So once now that we have this real-time system allowing us to render beautiful scenes, how can we use this apart from, of course, just reconstructing a static scene? So at first, I think cool applications, NeRFs. So think of it as NeRF plus selfie equals NeRF. This is a very cool paper where what you see here, the person is captured with, it captures a video of themselves moving a camera like this, and then a NeRF is trained and their image can be seen from any viewpoint that's close to the training cameras. And the first thought you might have is, wait, this is just NeRF, right? NeRF does exactly this. Well, not exactly, because you see the person cannot remain exactly static for the whole duration of the capture. And because of this, you know, they will move their head, they'll move their eyes, the hand holding the camera will become visible, maybe in the camera. The NeRF will be very blurry because of all this motion. So what this paper proposes really is a way to deal with this, with this motion, to deal with NeRFs representing deforming scenes. What they propose to do is learn a NeRF just as normal, almost just as normal, of a static scene, and have a deformation network that actually moves the input samples around to account for deformation. This deformation network takes as input the sample position and a latent vector learned per frame, so for each image a different latent vector, and then deforms the samples according to the motion of the scene, which it learns itself. And then additionally, there is another latent vector going into the NeRF to account for changes in the color of the scene. This, again, quite simple method. There is additional loss here, which I'm not explaining, but still a fairly simple idea allows them to produce beautiful reconstructions of people's faces. So this guy, look at his hair, like look at how well it's reconstructed. This would not be possible using meshes or traditional reconstruction methods. It's just stunning quality. And then here on the right, this person, you can see how well his glass are reconstructed, and how you can see there's actually a lens inside the glass, and how it looks, I think, quite realistic for what it is. Another interesting extension to NeRF is rendering, representing very large scenes using NeRF. So far, we talked about small scenes, so you know, maybe a single room, a single person. But what if we wanted to render a very large scene? So this method called block NeRF shows that they can represent scenes as large as half a square kilometer of a city, so 1,000 meters by 500 meters approximately of a city, in this case of San Francisco. And the training data comes from a car driving around the city with a number of cameras on it. And they drive through a city many times at different times of day, and so on and so forth, to then produce a NeRF, a neural representation of the few blocks of the city. So how does it work? First of all, they don't actually have one NeRF, they have many NeRF networks. They place a NeRF network on I think mostly intersections, and then on some paths, some lengths of the street between the intersections. And for every render, for every image you want to render, you query the nearby NeRF networks and then combine their outputs for a single render. More importantly, since images of streets and images of city can change between times of day, you know, people walking around and so on and so forth, you need to have some way to deal with these changes of appearance. And here in this paper, that means a slight change to network architecture. The network that generates the density is the same. So they assume that the city has uniform 3D structure, uniform geometry through time. However, the network that creates the RGB values for each sample takes additional inputs. One of them is exposure, which is a parameter of the camera taking the image. And the other is appearance embedding, which is a vector learned per frame of the data, which allows for changes like time of day or people walking by. You can see some examples of these changes in the 5 images here, where here you have an image on a sunny day, here a bit more cloudy, and then here an image at night. These are rendered using the same set of NeRF networks that constitute the block NeRF with different appearance vectors. So really quite an interesting, quite a powerful method. You can imagine this being used as maybe a free viewpoint version of Street View, or maybe for some self-driving car applications. I think massively exciting. Now, another thing you can do with NeRFs that is quite different is, for example, use them for estimating the pose of your camera. If you have a scene that you have already captured using NeRF, and now you have a new image of the scene, and you want to estimate the camera, that's something you can do as well. One application, as you can see, is, for example, if you go back to block NeRF, let's say the block NeRF of your whole city, and you have a self-driving car, the car takes an image of the city, you approximately know where the car is from GPS, but you don't know the exact location. You could use something like this to optimize the location of the camera, to have the exact location of the camera, from which you could learn the location of the car. And because NeRF is so easily differentiable, this is really quite simple. We take the estimated pose of the camera that we have, we sample some pictures in the image, we then render those pixels using NeRF, and we compare them to the ground truth image taken by the camera. We can then take the MSE loss on the pixels and backpropagate it through the whole network without modifying its weights, all the way to the camera pose, and then just use that signal to optimize the pose of the camera. So a very, very easy, again, simple, similar to NeRF, it's a very simple idea that seems to work very, very well. As we're running out of time, I'm just going to quickly mention some other extensions to NeRF that I think are also very exciting. One is instant graphics primitives, which is a method that allows for training NeRF in a few dozen seconds, perhaps a minute, even 15 seconds, as you can see here. So it tackles the other parts of the performance problem. We already talked about inference time, which we can make very fast using FastNeRF. Now, actually, some more methods, but here we can make the training part very fast, which is also exciting, I think. Another one is CoNeRF. This is a paper written co-authored by me and mostly written by a PhD student at the Warsaw University of Technology, Kacper Kania. And in this paper, we show that we can produce a controllable NeRF with very weak supervision, allowing us to modify some aspects of the scene with only a few labels. And there are dozens of others. There is NeRFs that generalize to multiple scenes. There is NeRFs that allow for changing the illumination of the scene. There is NeRFs specifically designed for videos. It's literally hundreds of methods these days, and I invite you to really look for them. There are some, if you Google awesome NeRF, you'll find a list on GitHub of dozens of very, very cool NeRF papers, and I invite you to really take a look. I think it's a fascinating new field. And so maybe as a final thought, my hope is that I get you interested in neural radiance fields or NeRFs, and who knows, maybe this is the future of graphics, and in the future we'll all be rendering things using NeRFs on our machines daily. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marek. Yeah, it was very interesting to learn about NeRFs. Yeah, it was really a cool topic. We have a bunch of questions in the Q&A section. Let me read the first one. Yeah, so the participant is admiring the capabilities of the model, and yeah, I am wondering about the hardware requirements to work with such a model. Is it possible to use it without whole GPU cluster?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I guess there are two parts of the answer. There's this training and inference time. Training takes, if you look at a static scene, so like vanilla NeRF, just the most standard version of NeRF, then it takes maybe 16 hours on a single GPU, like a V100, let's say. So not that long. You get reasonable results after 10 minutes. Like you can see that the scene more or less looks like it's supposed to look. So it's not that long. For inference, with the vanilla NeRF on a powerful GPU like 1390, it does take some seconds. But there are real-time versions of NeRF now. Like there's FastNeRF that we did and that I presented. There is Planoctries, Planoxels, KiloNeRF. There's lots of versions of NeRF that run in real time. And so it is possible to render in real time on a mid-range GPU now.
Nice. Yeah. So that actually brings the question of how do you see NeRFs being used, for example, in gaming? What are your views on that? Is like,
Quite a few things. So one is, of course, assets. Having some, you want to have a beautiful real world asset integrated into your computer game. Of course, you could use photogrammetry, take photos of it, reconstruct in traditional methods. But as you've seen, I think the results of something like NeRF look more realistic than results of traditional photogrammetry. And importantly, you get NeRF reproduces the materials of objects very well. So something like, for example, let's say skin, human skin, it's a very complex material to simulate, but you can do it using NeRFs easily because NeRF just learns from the images. So you can imagine it's being used for characters in games to make them look super realistic. You can imagine it's being used, like I said, instead of photogrammetry to capture objects. You want to capture some beautiful, complex, real-world object. Well, you can try photogrammetry, but you could also use a NeRF. In games, at least these days, I see someone mentioning bullet time in questions. Yeah, absolutely. Something like a bullet time in the Matrix, you could definitely do it. So you'd have a number of cameras imaging the scene, and then you could smoothly interpolate between the images from all the cameras using something like a NeRF. So yeah, absolutely. In movies, in the movie industry, certainly.
Yeah, that's really exciting to hear about. Yeah, it's gonna be I think breakthrough kind of model. And I wanted to ask like one more question from the like one questions from the session Q&A tab. Someone is asking about the possibilities to use this model to maybe rotate around the images of Mars or Moon, or when we don't have really that much of the pictures of the actual thing, right?
Right, I've seen this question. I'm not sure if I understand. If the author can specify in chat, that'd be fantastic. So do you mean like images taken by something like a rover on Mars? Is it something like this, or do you mean like a telescope image of the planet Mars? Well, I guess in either case, what you need to train your model is you need a number of images of a scene from different perspectives. So if you have the Curiosity rover driving on Mars around a rock, it takes the images of that rock from a few different perspectives, then yeah, you can then render this rock from any viewpoint close to the ones used for training. So you can do novel image synthesis for that rock. I mean, I guess similarly for planetary scale images. But of course, what you need is in order to generate a view from a camera here, you probably need one from camera here and a camera here. So you can create views that interpolate the views that you have already seen in training. So you can generate, if you have two cameras here, you can generate a view in the middle, but you can't generate from one that's here, probably because it's never been seen.
Yeah, sure. Okay, and there is one more question. When do you expect NeRF to be able to generate models for custom applications like Blender, like in Blender?
Oh, so NeRF models for like you mentioned, like for traditional graphics tools, if I understand correctly, yes.
Yeah, I think I understand like that. Yeah.
Let me read the question.
So maybe you get a picture of something and you want to get that inside of Blender from the pictures without really creating the model from ground up. Is it really something that NeRF can help?
That's a fascinating question. I think that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is if you already have a NeRF model, can you render it in Blender or in Unity or something? And I'm not sure when this will happen officially. I know that there are, some companies have internal efforts to do something like this, and I think it will happen, and it has to happen. And this is what I think NeRF really needs now, like this kind of automated capability, integration with existing tools. Traditional computer graphics have decades of prior work on tooling. NeRF now needs a lot of tooling, and I think this will happen soon. I've seen if you go to the Planoxels paper website, I think they have a way to view NeRFs in browser, for example. So you can already see some integration with traditional graphics. Who knows? Maybe a Blender plugin is the next thing.
Yeah, that will be really exciting application of that. We have a couple of questions in the session Q&A. Maybe let's wrap up for now, and yeah, we can continue the discussions there. Thank you very much, Marek, for being here with us, and thanks to you, to everybody who took part as a speaker. We really happy to have you here, and I wish you a very nice conference and all the best. Yeah, see you online.